Alright, then I'm Bilal Yusuf. I'll be the first and third speaker outside government representing Evergreen. The order is going to be really simple, just top of case and then 2 advantages. Time begins in 3, 2, 1, go. As shown from the resolution that the United States federal government should significantly decrease restrictions on human and gene editing. I think the way this around on net benefits is the policy around, and the quick definition is human gene editing, which is a precise technology using things like CRISPR, for example, that basically treat genetic traits, and it seems to cure illnesses like blindness or HIV, and you can change basic traits of a human being by just like scissoring out like certain genomes and then replacing it with something else. 2 observations at the top of case. The first is that human gene editing is currently heavily restricted in the United States. Right now, there's very elementary treatments that are being used, like CAR T, for example, but it's not actually being implemented widespread in hospitals. A lot of research is also being heavily restricted. Right now, in the United States, there is no clinical trials that are being allowed federally, and federal funds are also not allowed to be used on research that is on human embryos about altering them. The second observation is that other countries are already going to be pursuing gene editing. For example, China right now is leading in clinical trials. Over 48 active gene editing programs are currently active in China and are showing success. So we think the world, no matter what you do, is going to have gene editing, even if the United States doesn't pursue it. Then, the plan. The plan is the United States will reverse federal funding riders and legislative riders from the 2016 FDA appropriations. The time frame is as soon as possible. Specifically to explain the plan, the riders basically prevent the FDA from even reviewing research applications about the modification of genes. They basically halt all clinical applications because the FDA is literally not allowed to even have a process to undergo reviewing these gene applications. This also allows all these different programs that edit genes to receive federal funding from the government and apply for grants and other forms of funding like every other scientific program that exists in the United States. Now, the first advantage is on health. 3 points here. The first one, the disease kills millions of people in the status quo. It's really bad right now. The 8 points that 39 million people die every single year from diseases. The B points that 400 million people in the entire world suffer from chronic genetic diseases, and 30 million Americans make up of that 400 million. So we think that right now it is a really important issue in the United States. The second point is that it's getting worse, mainly because of the A point, which is pollution. Pollution creates genetic disorders, and pollution is only getting worse. 46% of the United States, or over 156 million people, live in areas with unhealthy levels of ozone pollution. California itself has 9 out of the 25 most polluted cities in North America. Wildfires are also getting worse and cause pollution. They're burning for 120% longer in 2026 than they ever have in the history of the entire world. The water quality is also worse in the United States. PFAS, which is like a harmful chemical, is existing in over half the United States tap water. Chemical air compounds in the air literally change your gene expression. Like when you are breathing in air that is inherently polluted, it is changing your chemical structure because it binds to your DNA and changes like the innate structure and causes diseases. Diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease that are incredibly debilitating to people change your brain genes. But with CRISPR, you can literally just scissor out like these Alzheimer's genes and replace it with healthy genes instead. Which is it's like pretty synonymous to smoking, right? Like the reason that people who smoke get cancer is because when you smoke, the smoke you're inhaling and the chemicals you're inhaling into your lungs are actively binding to your genes that exist in your body and changing them to become cancerous in the first place. Studies also show that people exposed to air pollution are 76% more likely to suffer from gene disorders. Especially ill people like children or the elderly who already suffer from genetic diseases are 6.3 times more likely to get a genetic disorder when they're exposed to pollution. The third point here is that gene editing uniquely solves. The 8 point is that CRISPR and Cas9 can directly modify gene cells. New versions of CRISPR have been shown success. They have a 30% success rate at curing cancer and other kinds of animals in their trials that they've currently been doing. The B point is that the Great Ormond Street Hospital basically engineered donor immune diseases that were able to treat previously incurable leukemia. So you've seen that in other countries where they're able to start using these technologies, there has been proven success of gene editing actually working. The C point is that NFR2, which is a new development in China. It's one of those 48 programs I mentioned in the top of case, and it's basically using chemoresistance, which is a new form of gene editing to solve for cancer. The main thesis of this entire contention is that we are reaching a ceiling in healthcare. There's only so much you can do to treat things like cancer and other genetic diseases. If you want to treat a genetic disease, you have to find the root cause, which is either just solving pollution, which is pretty hard, or solving the gene changing itself, which is the reason for the diseases. So if you want to solve genetic disorders, you have to change the genes. Eventually, we're going to have to solve all these issues because people are getting sick and they need help. Okay, second advantage is the economy. The first one is that healthcare is really expensive. The eighth one is that countries like the United States lack access to healthcare due to insane prices. The 36% of United States adults and 91 million people cannot afford healthcare, but 36% of people intentionally are stripped due to the cost. The B point is the amount of money being spent by consumers in hospitals and the money needed for healthcare is high because hospitals cannot cure a lot of diseases and they can only mitigate them, which means a lot of repeated visits from these same people to these hospitals, which incurs more costs for both the people and the hospitals. The second point is that healthcare costs are worsening right now in the status quo. The eighth point is that healthcare costs have only been worsening with record high global healthcare spending in the past 5 years. The B point is that healthcare will always remain inaccessible to people because it necessitates repeated visits while gene editing solves. Of course, gene editing is going to mean that you go to the hospital once, you receive treatment, and you don't have to go back because your genes have literally been modified to not only be resistant to this change in the future, but also to solve any existing problems you have. It is the future of healthcare. The third point here is the biotechnology industry is profitable. The eighth point is that the global CRISPR gene-based editing market is projected to reach $13.5 billion by 2033. The B point is that the field creates high-wage jobs with over 880,000 people being supported in the United States by the biotechnology industry. The C point is that studies from the American Enterprise Institute also found that innovations in gene therapy are estimated to be worth over $3.2 trillion to the national wealth every single year. The D point is that the S&P Biodex Index S&P had a 36% return compared to the S&P 500's 26% in 2025, which means that bio industry is not only profitable, but because it's profitable, it proves that there is stability in this, and there's going to be stability, and that it's actually working. We don't have people be investing in this industry if it was dying and unstable in the first place. Investment also means there's going to be more progress soon when the United States lifts restrictions, and if the United States doesn't lift restrictions, the investment is going to go to another country instead. The fourth point here is that regulation limits gene editing economy. The eighth point is that as of early 2026, human genome editing, or just human editing genes, has been completely banned. The B one is this caused economic output to decrease drastically. The links here is one on healthcare, costs decrease and people spend less and there's less demand. The B one is that people have more money to spend on productive parts of their economy and themselves. And it's the internal link to the economy is healthy people who can actually contribute to it in the first place. The second one here is on biotechnology industry. It resumes the boom in the industry and creates more jobs. The average wage in this industry was $81,000. The impact here is a better quality of life for everyone in the United States federal government because an uptrending economy means that everybody benefits. Never been proud to affirm. Thank you.
Cool. Hi judges, my name is Elia Lee. I'm going to be giving the first and third for litigation. Order is just going to be top of case, our contentions, and then their case. My time will start now. You don't want to get rid of a good thing that is happening right now. In the status quo, as my opponents tell you, the biotech industry is stable. Innovation is happening. There is so much potential, but voting AF is going to reverse all of that potential, never been prouder to negate. Let's go into some top of case. I think that their regulation proposal is just what already happened in 2018. That was when the germline editing, and that was when you can't. What is actually happening is that you can't edit human genome, and you don't have FDA funding for these kinds of trials. But the second thing is that somatic germline editing is permitted, but with long-term clinical trials. So that means that you have to test it over a long period of time, and that does get FDA funding, and that solves because people are still able to run trials. I think that is a really important point to test on their framing. They tell you that there are no clinical trials happening in the US, but there are no less than 71 clinical trials that are currently running in the US on somatic and germline editing in vitro. But next, they tell you about how other countries are leading and how there's 48 in China. I think top-level response to 1 week said that China is regulating right now. There are proposals in that are being developed right now. But 2 weeks said that the UN is currently pressuring China to stop, and China does care about this because they don't really want to get into this arms race. But 3 weeks said that beating the fire with this and having the US enter into this is going to lead to an arms race, which should be even worse. With that, our first contention is going to be on designer babies. We said that in the status quo, there's a strong demand for designer babies, but that is getting checked back by the regulations that are set by the FDA, and that is really, really important because of our second point, which is on the slippery slope. Because once you start editing for a couple hereditary diseases and genetic diseases, you can just open the door to editing for anything. For example, there was this company, Nucleus Genomics, that advertised IVF, where you could predict and change around 2,000 traits, including obesity, including eye color, hair type, etc. And that's our third point, is that there might be pressure to conform or keep up for economic or survival reasons. When a few babies get edited, it'll lead to a cultural shift where more and more people want to be part of this trend, and this trend would include height, intelligence, before people can even stop it. But the impacts are really important because this is irreversible. Because once you edit a human baby, then that means it can one, it can just spread to more children, and two, you can't fix it because your gene has been edited. The child gets injected through IVF, and then now you just have this child, and you cannot change what that child is like. But two, we say that these edits are present in every cell of the body, and that means that it includes sperm and egg. So this persists not only for the generation that gets edited, but also for generations to come. But thirdly, we'd say that there is no practical way to recall and re-edit everyone with mutations, or at worst, it would just be incredibly expensive and incredibly time-consuming. But fourth, we'd say that it is very, very hard to track for mutations because they can increase in propensity to disease and not show up immediately. So that means that even if the impacts show up 20 years down the line, it's already too late. Multiple generations have already been impacted. But fifth, we'd say that off-target effects are very, very prevalent. We'd say that mutations can affect multiple genes, i.e. CCRs for resistance to HIV actually caused more immune dysfunction, and that led to more problems in the long term. But the next big impact point here is going to be on the social bias and eugenics. We'd say that the first point here is that big companies try to advertise designer babies to the public. They try to oversell their impacts, and they get more consumers in this way. We say that these big companies' advertising is incredibly powerful. Just think of how Jewel advertised to kids and advertised from a young age. And we said that this would lead to mass racism and ableism because this shows that some traits are more desirable than others, and that it's just okay to get rid of those traits just because they're not societally accepted. Our second contention is going to be on the off-target environmental impact. First, we say that mutations spread into wild populations via mating or pollination. That's just the way that biology works. That means that if a couple people have, as we said before, if a couple people have their gene editing, that spreads into the wild population. But secondly, we say that these crops become unstable or they fail because they become uniform, so one disease can just take them out. For example, our bananas today are completely different from the bananas 20 years ago because a lot of them were genetically modified. That meant that one blight could just take all of them out. That is also what happened with the Irish potato famine because of genetically similar crops. But thirdly, we'd say that they spread quickly because of gene drive or because of natural selection. And finally, we'd say that the unintended consequences would happen because species depend on each other. For example, here's getting prevalent human diseases. The impacts of these are pretty clear. The first is just going to be on famine and resource wars because when there is a lack of crops because one blight took them all out, that leads to more people getting killed. That leads to 10 million crops dying a year. And two, we'd say on climate change, keystone species are especially important that sequester carbon and they die and this causes climate change. Our third contention is going to be on inequality. First, we said that this would create two classes of society because there's the ones who can afford this new technology and there's the ones that cannot. And this would start out expensive because more companies can make a higher profit that way. And we also just said that there are inherently high costs to try to edit the human genome. That is obviously going to take a lot of money. And the disadvantages compound over time. For example, if you're smarter and you're richer, then you can buy better gene editing that increases inequality. And that basically means that the poorer class gets poorer and poorer, and one class is just so superhuman that they can just take all the high-skilled jobs. That leads to mass poverty. But also we said that leads to patents because it's expensive to be a genetic editing company, and that kills innovation because that means that the technology isn't being shared. For example, Monsanto Canada versus Percy Schmeier had a company that was basically a gene editing cell accidentally flew into a farmer's land, and they got sued for this. And but they only had the technology, so there wasn't any regulation. Moving on to their case. The first thing to talk about is about how a lot of people are dying from disease and it's getting worse. But the problem with this is that they give you a bunch of other reasons why these diseases are happening. They tell you about pollution, they tell you about water quality, but the thing is that this is actually a turn for our side because what they are doing is that they're shifting the attention away from actually fighting pollution and fighting water quality to just genetically editing babies for the richest 1% of the population while everyone else is just going to face all the climate harms for the rest of the world. But also this is a turn on trust because when the public doesn't trust this medicine, then they basically are just not going to believe that the medicine and the technology is going to work, and that just turns the benefits of their case. But next they talk about how you can just scissor out, you can just scissor out these genes, but that just doesn't really work because again, there are a lot of errors in the gene. For example, CRISPR fails 15% of the time right now. Next, to talk about how people are getting like exposed to air pollution. Again, like the people who are probably the most vulnerable to this air pollution and to bad water quality probably have the least access to like the gene editing technology. So that's not going to solve this accessibility at all. But next we talk about like the ceiling of medicine. Again, I don't think that we're facing a ceiling right now. There are so many other biotechnologies that are being developed. For example, using organisms to like fight to act as antibiotics, etc. Next on this thing about the economy of healthcare. But the thing is here is that right now our CRISPR and our gene editing is not good enough to be spread to the public. And the reason why that is really important is that if anything bad happens, then all development is going to stop. It's going to reverse all the product, and it's going to be incredibly costly to reverse these impacts. We said that also, gene editing is not a cheap thing. It is incredibly expensive. It's not a one and done. And if it goes wrong, then you need to spend so much more money just to fix the problems that you caused. Next, we talk about how biotech is like a really good sector in the status quo. Yes, we are advocating for the status quo, where biotech is very, very stable. This is going to destabilize it because the population loses trust in the gene editing because they see so many issues. The thing is that gene editing is not a bad thing, but right now it is not ready to be developed for the public. There are no regulations in place in order to make sure that it's going to be spread equally throughout society, and it's going to just cause more harm than it could do good.
Hey, great speech. Order is going to be first on the top of the case, just a little flash there. Then I'll be going off case, gov case, in the order it was read. Okay, my time begins in 3, 2. Okay, starting off on the top of case, the first observation about how human gene editing is heavily restricted pretty much goes conceded. They talk about how it's not super regulated in the status quo, with like different things being like allowed in 2018 with germline editing, but I'll get onto that a little bit later on the plan. The second thing we told you that other countries, like for example China, are already pursuing gene editing, and this means that regardless of whether the USFG decreases the regulations, other countries are going to do it, and they're going to be ahead, and they're going to have all these benefits that we talked about in our case. They tell you that China is regulating due to like pressure from the UN. It's going to cause like an arms race, etc. First, this arms race point like isn't implicated super well, so I wouldn't say that they don't really have an impact for this. So don't buy it; they don't warrant it at all. Then also, China bypasses regulations in the status quo because companies offshore manufacturing to China because of their allowed cheap abusive labor. Look at like all these like major corporations like Nike and whatnot who like offshore their production to countries like China. Look at how everything's literally made in China because it's so easy to like bypass regulations. And regulations just decrease there, and they just allow innovation. And we also see like China like a lot more lax, and they allow for a lot more innovation than the United States. So they just face like less backlash from people. Okay, then onto the plan. They say in 2018 germline editing was allowed, and they give you this point how there's 71 clinical trials right now that are happening with human germline editing. Judge, this is just empirically false. In early 2026, human germline editing was banned in the United States and in 70 other countries. The entire reason we're having this debate is because new regulations have been passed. So maybe in 2018 this law did pass and it was unregulated, but in early 2026, like, I don't know the exact date, but in this year, like maybe in the past like 2 months or so, it has been banned. That's why we're having this debate. That's why we're talking about it. We see this regulation is increasing in the status quo, and we're saying that we should not be increasing regulation, we should be decreasing it. So regardless of whether this was happening, and we see that even if you do buy in 2018 that like these germline editing was allowed, we can see like this you can directly attribute this to all the economic growth I gave you about why germline editing and why gene editing and the biotechnology sector was doing so well. But now because early 2026, when we implemented these new regulations and banning it once more, the economy just kind of plummeted, and I'll tell you that again later in my contention. But moving on to their first disadvantage about designer babies. Okay. The first thing they tell you is that the first main thing they tell you is about this point about a slippery slope, about how you're going to change everything. Like for example, their skin color, eye color, hair color, etc. But judge, first, you can turn this argument because they literally tell you that it allows people to be like taller, stronger, smarter, less obese. These are good things. Like having a smarter population is good things for a couple of reasons. First, smarter people make better policy-making decisions. Like a good warrant for this is 67% of Trump's voters did not have a college degree. This literally, and I think we can all agree in this room that Trump has passed terrible policies. For example, bombing Iran, increasing the prices of oil, kidnapping Maduro, and taking over like Venezuela. All of these things have been terrible policies. So we see that when people are more educated, they make better decisions in the United States. And we see that right now, the education in the United States has like really been failing. So making people just smarter, like they tell you, would probably be a better impact. And also making people like stronger and like less obese is good for that health, right? It just means that they live longer and they live better lives. So those are probably gonna be good impacts. And all this stuff about like eye color and whatnot, I'll get into on this next point. Okay, the next main point they have, first they tell you it's irreversible and stuff, but I think if we prove that gene editing is good, then it doesn't really matter whether it's reversible or not. And then, on this third, the next offensive point they have in this argument is social bias and eugenics. They basically say big companies are going to market this a lot, and people are kind of going to only have the most desirable traits, and they're just going to disregard things that they don't view as important. But first, this is false. Look at cultural pride movements and advocacy that exist in the United States. Cultures have their own pride, especially different ethnicities and races. Look at, for example, the Black Power movement or the Harlem Renaissance, where people do have pride in their culture. They're not going to so easily just disregard all the things they've been building for so long, because these things are going to exist in the status quo. For example, someone African American in the United States is not all of a sudden just going to choose to make their child white because they have pride for their culture and pride for who they are. And then also, pretty privilege is going to be real and it's going to be unsolvable in either world because beauty is subjective. We tell you that not everybody is going to make their child look the exact same because not everybody likes the way, not everybody perceives people the exact same way. The way that people perceive beauty changes between every single person. So while people might look differently, that's not going to change. That doesn't mean everybody's going to look the same or certain traits are going to be a lot more common than others. Okay. Then on the second point about the environment. First, the resolution is about editing on humans specifically, so any of their points about crops and whatnot don't really apply here. We're specifically talking about human gene editing. Gene editing on crops is just completely different. Second is this is all non-unique because GMOs in agriculture are already super widespread, and agriculture is already mostly unrestricted in comparison. They're resistant to fertilizer, disease, etc. So we said gene editing on crops is allowed a lot in the status quo. For example, with bananas. Okay. On the third disadvantage about inequality, they basically say that some people will afford it and some people can't, and this is going to compound things. It means some people are going to be smarter than others. It's going to create a lot of inequality in the status quo, and it's going to be really, really bad. But there's a couple points here. First, this is false because it is only accessible in the gov world for two main reasons. First, is funding and more innovation is the internal link to decreasing price. If you don't give them more funding, if you don't create more innovation, these things are never going to become more accessible. Because my opponents are increasing regulation in the status quo, like I told you, they banned it in early 2026, we see that it's only going to become more expensive and more inaccessible because companies can't afford to make it cheaper. They can't afford to make innovations that make it more accessible. But when you give them funding through grants and whatnot and allow them to actually conduct studies, they're going to be able to make it cheaper and more accessible. That's why we're funding it in the first place. The second point is economic benefits mean that it's good to make it accessible. We tell you that it's beneficial for companies and for the government to try and make this accessible because it provides a lot of economic benefits, a lot of health benefits, which I'll get into now on the advantages. The first advantage was on health. Hey, the first thing we tell you about how health is getting worse right now, about it's caused by pollution and all that causes a ton of gene editing. They say that we should shift from fighting the environment, which is better, and the public doesn't trust the medicine. First, this point about the environment, both can exist. There's a prerequisite of fighting the environment. It's being able to live and not be sick, right? We tell you that before we solve pollution, you need to have people who can actually be alive to fight pollution in the first place. And we also tell you that solving pollution is an entirely different issue. So I also don't think solving pollution is possible or going to happen in either world. Whether one side mitigates it or not, it's not going to be solved. However, we solve for the effects of pollution. Which means that pollution doesn't really have much of an impact on people at least. We need to at least solve the diseases that pollution causes. Okay. Another point about how the public doesn't trust the medicine. This is hypocritical because they claim that they don't bite into your disadvantages if they don't use them. There's no reason why people wouldn't trust the medicine. Then on this point about how there's least access to editing, we said that access increases. Look at what I told you. For example, a good warrant about this is computer technology. We said that laptops and computers in general were super expensive when they were first invented because they were just inaccessible, and now they've been becoming more and more accessible as time goes on. Then they say that it fails 50% of the time. Again, this is literally why we're allowing for more innovation and allowing for more funding, so it becomes more accurate and more usable for the public. Then they say that there's a bunch of different things. On this point about a ceiling in medicine, we think that we are reaching a ceiling in medicine, and that it is literally impossible to solve diseases that are caused by gene mutations without gene editing. They say we have things using organisms to create antibiotics, but that doesn't solve for issues where you literally just can't solve diseases that come from genes. So you need to solve those. And on the second advantage about the economy, this is not good enough in the status quo, and that gene editing is super expensive. We said that the reason we're funding this is so healthcare decreases in price, since the people need to just go. They dropped this entire analysis about how when you don't need to go to the hospital so many times for your chronic disease, and instead just solve it once with gene editing, costs decrease because people just have to spend less money on healthcare, which decreases healthcare. And they also drop all the warrants we gave you about how biotechnology creates a ton of jobs. Never been proud to affirm. Thank you.
some framework at the top. Our arguments, their arguments.
Where do you want me to flow though?
You can flow it on a new sheet, or you can flow it on their argument sheet.
Okay. So, sorry, one more time.
It's going to be the overview,
Mm-hmm.
some top of case points, their case, our case, and then one.
Okay. Thank you.
In order for them to get access to any of their impacts, you have to buy 5 things first. First, you have to believe that genetic editing technology will actually be accessible to the general public, not just the elites. Second, you have to buy that the off-target consequences that we've seen time and time again because of genetic editing won't happen. Then after that, third, you have to believe that people use genetic editing for good things, not just for racism. Then after that, you have to believe that genetic editing never goes wrong because out of Ellie's speech, they can see that even one instance of genetic editing goes wrong kills public trust and investment in genetic editing. And then after that, fifth, you have to believe that for some reason, giving everyone a uniform genome is going to be a productive thing when we've seen that time and time again, if everyone has the same genome, that makes it easier for disease to spread. These 5 things are things you have to trudge through before casting a ballot for them, and I'll weigh why these are 4 important. Let's start on the top of case debate. They talk a lot about how China is doing genetic editing in the status quo. 3 responses to this. First, this is just incorrect. The argument about China bypassing regulation or offshoring is incorrect because the reason why China isn't doing genetic editing is because it doesn't want to. All of the reasons we've explained to you as to why genetic editing can lead to famine, as to why it can lead to racism, and why it can increase disease are reasons why China isn't doing it in the status quo. But the second point is that if China is doing genetic editing in the status quo, they can see that it's only because they want to compete with the United States to be the global hegemon. That's the only reason why China is genetic editing. If we stop, China isn't going to pour millions and millions of dollars into an uncertain technology. No, they will stop as well. But third, they don't actually prove why this is an impact in the round. There's still link differential. We don't want people in the US to become more racist. We don't want more economic divide in the US. That's still an impact in the round. So let's go on to their arguments about health and about the economy. 3 top-level responses that are conceded out of the LOC. And the biggest one is the healthcare turn. We told you that we've seen time and time again, when a technology goes wrong, public trust plummets and investor confidence plummets. For example, we saw a COVID vaccine create bad impacts and lots of people decided not to take the vaccine. We saw investor confidence plummet the moment a technology went wrong. And when we told you so many risks of genetic editing, so many reasons why it could go wrong, and so many reasons why it's perceived to be an awful technology, that turns all of their arguments about investment. Because right now we have investment, it's just regulated. Investor confidence is high because investors believe that the FDA has got this in the bag, that the FDA is regulating in the status quo. Any risk of our offense entirely takes out theirs, because the moment something goes wrong, that poisons public trust in the system. But the second turn that they clean drop is the turn on how rich people caring about healthcare is the most important impact. Because if you buy to any degree that not all the poor people in the world are going to have access to this expensive genetic editing technology, this turn is incredibly important to your ballot. What did we tell you? The only reason why healthcare gets investment in the status quo, development in the status quo, is because rich people need that healthcare and therefore they're incentivized to invest in healthcare. They're incentivized to prop up the healthcare system. But when rich people can just circumvent the healthcare that everyone else can access by getting this special expensive GMO stuff, they're not going to invest in the types of healthcare that are more accessible to people, like cancer treatment, like things that people rely on to fix their asthma, like medicines that are more accessible and cheaper for everyone. That means even if they help the richest 1% of the population, or even half of the population, the most vulnerable actors in this motion are always going to be harmed. That's a turn. It's conceded they can't respond to it. But then the third point here is we told you that healthcare and jobs were at a high in the status quo. Why is this true? All of their arguments about healthcare investment flow to our side, because in the status quo, healthcare is creating jobs. In the status quo, we see that antibiotics are expanding. In the status quo, we see cancer treatment getting better. In the status quo, we see more jobs. All of their uniqueness is in the wrong direction. But even if you buy their case, I'll give you independent reasons to vote for us. Independent reasons our arguments outweigh. So let's start on a couple clarifications. I just want to be really clear about what the status quo is. In the status quo, there is permitted investment in somatic gene editing. What that means is that if I'm a person, I'm an adult, I can edit my genes as long as there have been long-term clinical trials for the edits that I've had. The actual delta in this round is on germline editing. What does that mean? It's editing your embryo. It's making sure that your kid has 2,000 traits that you find to be desirable. That is the problem in this round. That's going to outweigh because the link differential is the highest in that category. But then let's talk about our offense. I'll give you 3 voters. The first one is on access. This is extremely important because if we win any of our economic impacts, any risk of our economic impacts, that is a prerequisite to their case. Because even if GMOs are extremely cheap, if you are extremely poor, because there's now 2 classes of society and extreme inequality, you're not going to be able to buy their medicine in the first place. You're not going to be able to get their biotech jobs in the first place. So what was our offense here? We told you 2 things. First, we told you that the reason why genetic technology is expensive is not because of investment. It's because, 1, the technology is inherently expensive to manufacture, but the more important one is that companies want the prices to be high because rich people are willing to pay those high prices to make their kids have blonde hair, blue eyes, not be obese, and be extremely tall. That means the most productive thing and the most cost-effective thing for companies to do is to raise prices so they can make as much money as possible. But second, and this is what they concede, is that even if prices are originally low, the inequality compounds over time. What that means is that even if the gene editing was like pretty cheap and a couple of rich people could access it, the inequality got bigger and bigger. Because if you were richer, you could buy intelligence, and then that made you richer, and then you could buy more intelligence. That happened over and over again. And that means that no matter how cheap it is, inequality goes at a rate that's faster than how much they can decrease the price of genetic editing. The impacts of this are absolutely massive. It's the economic collapse of our society, or at least the segregation of a large group of our society. We told you this makes 2 classes of society. One that takes all the high-skilled jobs, all the high-labor jobs, and another one that is stigmatized in society, that cannot get jobs, and that faces racism on the daily because they are part of the inferior class of humans. We don't want eugenics all over again. This impact is a prerequisite to their case. But the second voter in this round is going to be on designer babies. We told you something extremely important here. We told you that mistakes can happen and mistakes do happen. We told you that the CCR for resistance to HIV actually caused immune dysfunction, so the FDA had to regulate it, they had to pull it back. That's a reason why it's very likely that mistakes will happen. And all these arguments they tell you about pollution messing up your genome are more reasons why mistakes can happen. Because after you edit your genome, the pollution can mess it up, and then that gene can get spread to the entire population very rapidly because of natural selection. What this means is that mistakes can happen, mistakes are likely to happen, and these mistakes are likely to spread across the population through both reproduction and natural selection, because now you're a human who's more likely to survive. The examples of crops we give you are actually very relevant here. Of course, we haven't seen a large-scale example of this on humans, but when we do see examples, we see the entire species of bananas getting wiped out. We see the Irish potato famine that killed millions and millions of people. Do you really want to risk this with a human disease, where when everyone has the same genome, you are more and more likely to have one singular disease that they themselves say is increasingly likely due to climate change wipe out the entire population? No, we want to hedge our bets. We need to make sure this big magnitude impact does not matter. But then finally, we told you genetic editing wasn't going to be for good, it was going to be for eugenics. Because big companies were going to target existing biases that their cultural movements could never overcome. This looks like Indian companies targeting people to decrease their skin tone to make it lighter, even though cultural movements do exist. All this causes is more eugenics. All this causes is a risk of mass disease. So many things for you to trudge through to cast your ballot for them and to vote for the NEC.
Yeah, this is just going to be some voting issues and then weighing. Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how good gene editing is if most of the population simply can't access it, and if most of the population is actually going to get worsened by it because the public decreases all trust in biotech, they decrease funding for healthcare regulation and climate change regulation just because the 1% doesn't care anymore, just because the 1% can access all of their benefits. I think this is still a clear vote for the negation. I think the first question that Vidika tells you that I want to extend in this round is who gets to access. You can weigh their points about how innovation just magically makes things cheaper versus our conceded warrants that gene editing has inherent costs that just cannot go down, and also the incentive for companies why is this dropped? Because we tell you that they know that the rich people are going to buy the gene editing either way, so they might as well just go high with the price, and they might as well just offset the incredibly high costs to even do gene editing. The companies are not just going to magically put the prices down, and even if they do that, they're not going to access the people who need it the most, the people who live in areas with high pollution, with high water, with bad water quality, and with bad access to healthcare. You can also extend our points on healthcare debt, on climate change, extend all of this. Because what they are doing is that they're reversing all the progress that is already made and just making it more and more inaccessible to the general public. But let's just look at what they do. I think that on our offense, what they talk about is how we're going to be making better policymakers, and they talk about how this is just going to solve for a bunch of problems. But the thing is that one, this might just not even solve for problems. I think that this is just simple probability weighing. Because what we tell you is that 15% of CRISPR goes wrong. What does that mean? That means that more than 1 in 10 people are going to have something go wrong with their CRISPR editing. That is simple probability. So that means that a couple people, sure, a couple of really, really rich people get this gene editing technology. That means that there's an incredibly high probability that at least one of them is going to have something go wrong. That case will be massively publicized. Trust is going to decrease. Why does this have a broader impact? This has a broader impact because this does not only impact gene editing, but this impacts all biotech, all trust in the healthcare system. This goes clean dropped out of the LOC. But what we do tell you is that innovation is not unique to their side. Again, we tell you that they had 71 plus trials. You went from having no CRISPR to having some CRISPR. CRISPR was developed in the US. Clearly some innovation is still happening. And what we do tell you is that you can't have lengthy clinical trials in order to do somatic cell in order to have somatic cell gene editing happen. I think innovation happens in both worlds. But what does happen, what the only differential is if that innovation is good, if that innovation is happening regulated, and if that innovation is happening for long-term stability. I think you can just weigh this pretty cleanly here. Because the economy is a prerequisite to healthcare. If you do not have any resources to even get basic healthcare, much less gene editing, I don't think you can access the healthcare at all. If you can't access any of that, then you can't access their impacts. They spend a lot of time telling you about how bad the healthcare system is. Yes, the healthcare system is bad. That means that more and more people are are structurally skewed out of healthcare. But two would say that any risk of gene editing malfunctions permanently causes all trust and investment to go away. You can't just reverse this because just as you can't reverse gene editing, you can't reverse this break in trust. And even if that trust does build up maybe later, there's also going to be so many more people who just always are going to be thinking about that breach in the trust. And I think that the third thing that you can just weigh on here is irreversibility. Because you can make good gene editing later, but recalling a bad mutation is always going to be impossible. It's always going to be near impossible at least. Innovation does not have the capacity to just get rid of the chance that mistakes happen. I think you can vote on the risk of creating two classes of society with mass inequality that does not only impact gene editing, the ability to gene edit, but all facets of society. This has a huge magnitude on the risk of genetic uniformity, including increases in probability for mass disease and mass suffering. The vote is very, very clear. No one can get access. The people who need it the most cannot access all of their good impacts. They do not do enough work to prove this to you. All they do is create more harm.
Alright, great two speeches. The order is going to be simple. Just going to be explaining, or I'll be honest, it might be a little bit messy, but it's just going to be made to explain why you don't go off and then why you vote up. Everyone is ready. Time will begin. My first word. First, Judge, the opposition loses this round when they lose accessibility. All of their impacts are reliant on people not able to access this technology in the first place. We win on accessibility for three reasons. One, we win on accessibility because you can look at technologies like cars, computers, etc., which were initially expensive and became cheaper. They give you no analysis or no reason why healthcare would be any different than computers or cars. They give you a clear analysis about why it would become cheaper. When you have the production of goods and it becomes more widespread, you can just make them for cheaper over time because innovations mean the production of these goods is overall going to become cheaper because you're only producing it more people are buying it. Obviously, you're going to be able to innovate it to make it cheaper in the first place. Companies are always going to want to make their goods cheaper so they can sell them for the same price and make more money. If you make goods for cheaper, you're obviously going to make more money as a company, which means you always have the incentive to innovate and make your goods cheaper, which means you automatically... Yes.
We make the argument in the LOC that companies are going to sell the genetic editing technology for high prices. So the new response that companies would not sell it for high prices because it's more cost effective for them to sell it at cheaper prices is a new response to that articulation that was in our case in the LOC.
my partner on the first advantage of health responds to you guys. You say there's less access to editing. He says access increases because one, you can look at computers, cars, etc. As tech exists, it becomes cheaper over time. Companies sell goods that are cheaper because it makes money. He says that on the first advantage. Judge discretion.
Okay.
I'm at 42 seconds. Time resumes in 3, 2, 1, go. So we give you the analysis. That is what makes the most money. You've seen it happen in the past. There's no reason why it will happen in the future. Second reason we went on disability is a clean drop hospital visits. We give you the analysis that mitigation means just higher costs. Meaning that when you have to continue going to the hospital because you have a chronic genetic disorder, you're going to spend a lot more money on healthcare, which is why healthcare is expensive right now in the status quo. Because we don't have solutions for things like leukemia. We don't have solutions for Alzheimer's or cancer. So that is why people keep going to the hospital. Why things like chemotherapy are so expensive. But when you only have to go to the hospital one time and you get solved, all of a sudden all the costs are going to disappear because it's way cheaper for you to just go to the hospital once than so many times in a row. Then, the third reason we win is on the weighing analysis of the try or die judge. They completely mishandle this argument because we think this outweighs on terminal cancer. We think that if you have terminal cancer and you know you have this debilitating chronic disease, like we tell you, you're probably going to end up taking the risk anyways because it outweighs. Your people are always going to want to survive. We give you this analysis on the first advantage when we tell you the ceiling to healthcare and many people are suffering right now. Then, on the status quo, they tell you that only the incentive flows neg, but they don't actually understand this investment isn't in the United States. The point is that investment is good in other regions, so there's no reason why we shouldn't open up United States companies to investment as well from the government and other companies because it is doing well in other places. This means this means that all the disadvantages happen in both worlds. But the link differential is that in our world, the United States can uniquely access all the advantages of the affirmative. In their world, they don't, and the United States falls behind, and other countries pull ahead. The B point here is on pollution. They can see that nobody can solve pollution in the status quo because climate change is inevitable and nobody's going to have the incentive to change. They can see that right now the elites don't care about climate change already and there is no incentive to solve climate change. This means that we again win on the link differential. We show that 46% of people in the status quo in the United States right now live in pollution and it's only going up because of wildfires and water pollution and other forms of air pollution. We think the link differential is that we offset the impacts of pollution in their world, in our world, and they don't. In their world, pollution continues to get worse and everybody dies because Americans continue to get these genetic disorders, continue to get cancer and other diseases because they don't have any avenues for change. In our world, they at least have an avenue for change, which means because you can actually alter the genes from the very basis of genome itself. In their world, 30 million Americans right now just continue to suffer and die and go to the hospitals in every single month because they cannot afford to solve the disease and there is no avenue for any solution. This is a try or die scenario, just you automatically vote out on the risk of solving all these impacts because pollution and climate change is inevitable and the largest impact around. Evaluate magnitude first because solving the big sick impacts in the round should come before any impact because it is literally a try or die. We don't want all Americans to die under the weighing mechanism that benefits. So evaluate that first. Then C point is on success. They tell you that only 50%. There's a 50% fail rate. 50% fail rate for no investment prior is really good. And my partner gives the analysis. The reason we want investment is to decrease this fail rate. We tell you that when it fails, it's bad. But we literally tell you in our world, it just doesn't fail that much. We think that trials are still going to exist. All these clinical things still exist in our world. We don't reduce regulation at all. All we do is increase yes.
The argument you make in your PMC and that we make in the LOC is that the plan reduces regulation significantly. So the articulation in the PMR that you are not reducing regulation at all is a new articulation in the PMR.
I think I misspoke. The argument here is that we're not reducing restrictions. Like we're not making it harder for people. Let me articulate this correctly. What we're saying is that there's going to be more investment in these gene editing programs. Not only are they able to receive grants and funding, they're also going to be able to actually go through these clinical trials in the FDA, like we told you in the plan, which means they're going to be able to pass, they're going to establish the technologies with higher accuracy. That is the argument I'm trying to make. I'm at 3:31. Time resumes in 3, 2, 1, go. The D point here is the most damning of all of them, and that is the ceiling, Judge. The ceiling goes very well with the triad argument. They tell you that there's organisms that are currently using antibiotics to try and solve these diseases. Judge, antibiotics are for bacterial infections. Antibiotics cannot solve things like yes.
The argument we make in the LOC is that there isn't a ceiling to medicine because we see examples of medicine improving like these antibiotics. That was conceded in the MD, so any response to that?
It was not conceded. On the first advantage of health, my partner clearly tells you, this is that orgs fight antibiotics. My partner clearly tells you antibiotics fight bacterial diseases, not genetic ones. Antibiotics cannot solve the root cause of gene disorders, which is genes themselves. We've given you this analysis that the root cause of these diseases is in genes since the very first speech. I'm at 3:46. Time resumes in 3, 2,
1, go. That means in their world, none of these diseases ever get solved. Because to solve genetic disease, you have to actually change the genome in the first place. If you don't change the genome, there's literally no point to doing anything because you cannot solve the disease. We think that in their world, their analysis, the analysis we give you about how you have to continue going to the hospital, to continue mitigating these effects, continue to happen. Even if technology is increasing, they never solve the root problem. Even if they're slightly mitigating the effects more and more, you people will always have these diseases, no matter when either world, which means they continue having to go to the hospital. All these economic inequalities they continue to exist, and people continue to be poor because they're not able to afford to solve the diseases. They continue to live in poverty. They continue to die because of these genetic diseases that they're forced to be subjected to because there is no solution for them. You vote ask for a solution. Okay, next. On weighing, okay, we have the biggest on eugenics. On eugenics, two things. One, we outweigh cultural norms by shifting to saving millions to billions of lives over time through genetic diseases. Pollution is inevitable. Billions and billions of people have pollution disorders. So we think if we solve them in the status quo, they don't. Second, the extent that change is minimal in this watch. Cultures will survive with movements despite oppression or change. People are proud of their cultures. There's no reason they give you why they'll stop being proud of their cultures all of a sudden. Like, I'm proud of my culture. I'm sure they are too. The Harlem Renaissance is completely dropped. There's literally no reason they give you about why people will stop caring about themselves and their cultures because people love themselves. That one proud to confirm. Thank you.
Cool.
That was super fun.